Picture this. The fog rolls across the frozen fields of Moravia on a December morning in 1805. Three emperors stand poised for battle, one Russian start who, one Austrian, and one French up, dared to crown himself among Europe's ancient royalty. By sunset, two of those emperors would flee the field in tears, their armies shattered, their pride broken. The third would emerge as the undisputed master of continental Europe. This is the story of Austerlitz, the battle that transformed Napoleon Bonaparte from a brilliant general into a legend whose shadow would stretch across the world for decades to come. But to understand how one man could orchestrate such a devastating victory against overwhelming odds, we need to travel back to the summer of 1805, when Europe was convulsing with the fury of the Third Coalition. The continent had watched with growing alarm as Napoleon consolidated power in France, crowning himself emperor in a ceremony that sent shockwaves through the royal courts of Europe. The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a man who had risen from obscurity, seized control of a revolution, and now dared to place a crown upon his own head, while ancient dynasties looked on in horror. The response was swift and decisive. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, offended by Napoleon's imperial pretensions, began weaving a web of alliances designed to crush the French upstart once and for all. Austria, still smarting from previous defeats, eagerly joined the cause. Britain, ever Napoleon's most persistent enemy, provided the gold and naval power that bound the coalition together. By the summer of 1805, nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers were marching toward France from multiple directions. The trap seemed perfect, the outcome inevitable. Yet Napoleon had spent his entire career turning impossible situations to his advantage. While his enemies gathered their forces, he was orchestrating one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. In late August, he turned his back on the English Channel, where he had been preparing an invasion of Britain, and wheeled his Grande Armée eastward with lightning speed. What followed was a masterclass in strategic deception and tactical brilliance that would become known as the Ulm Campaign. The Austrian general Mack had positioned his army at the fortress city of Ulm, confident that his strong defensive position would allow him to hold until Russian reinforcements arrived. It was a reasonable plan, executed by a competent commander, but Napoleon had anticipated exactly this move. While Mack waited for an attack that never came, French columns were sweeping around his flanks in a massive wheeling movement that cut his army off from Vienna and trapped it in a vise of French steel. The speed of Napoleon's advance was breathtaking. His soldiers, hardened by years of campaigning and inspired by their emperor's presence, covered ground at a pace that left their enemies stunned. They marched through rain and mud, across rivers and through forests, their columns stretching for miles across the German countryside. Local villagers watched in awe as the Grande Armée swept past, banners flying, drums beating, the iron of their muskets glinting in the autumn Sunday. By October 20th, the trap had snapped shut. General Mack, realizing his hopeless position, surrendered at Ulm with over 25,000 men. The Austrian army, once a formidable force, had been eliminated without Napoleon even needing to fight a major battle. The psychological impact was devastating. Across Europe, the news spread like wildfire. The French emperor had achieved in weeks what most generals could not accomplish in months. But Napoleon was far from finished. With the Austrian army neutralized, he turned his attention to the approaching Russians under General Kutuzov. Here was a more dangerous opponent, a cagey old veteran who understood that his only hope lay in avoiding decisive battle until reinforcements could arrive. Kutuzov began a fighting retreat, trading space for time, hoping to draw Napoleon deeper into hostile territory where winter and extended supply lines might accomplish what Russian arms could not. The pursuit that followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse across the Austrian countryside. Napoleon's cavalry harassed the Russian rearguard, while his main body pressed forward relentlessly. Villages emptied as the armies passed, their inhabitants fleeing with whatever possessions they could carry. The roads became choked with refugees, soldiers, and supply wagons, creating a chaotic scene that stretched for miles. Vienna, the glittering capital of the Habsburg Empire, fell to French forces in mid-November. The sight of French tricolors flying over the ancient city sent shockwaves through European society. This was no longer just another military campaign. This was the reshaping of continental power, the rise of a new order that would challenge everything the old world represented. Yet even as Napoleon celebrated his victories, he faced a growing problem. His army was now deep in enemy territory, far from its bases, while the Russians continued to receive reinforcements. Tsar Alexander himself had arrived to take personal command of the Allied forces, bringing with him not just fresh troops, but also the promise of Austrian units that had escaped the Ulm disaster. The numbers were beginning to turn against the French emperor. By late November, the strategic situation had crystallized around the small Moravian town of Austerlitz. Here, on ground that would become immortal in military history, 3 emperors prepared to stake everything on a single throw of the dice. The Allied forces, now numbering nearly 90,000 men, held strong positions on the high ground around the Pratzen Heights. Below them, Napoleon's 68,000 soldiers occupied the lower ground, seemingly trapped between superior numbers and difficult terrain. To the Allied commanders, the situation appeared ideal. They possessed numerical superiority, advantageous ground, and high morale following their successful concentration of forces. Tsar Alexander, young glory, press and eager fought for immediate attack, despite the warnings of more experienced officers. Emperor Francis of Austria, though more cautious, agreed that the moment had come to crush Napoleon once and for all. But appearances can be deceiving, especially when Napoleon Bonaparte is involved. Even as the Allied armies took their positions on the commanding heights, the French emperor was weaving a web of deception that would turn their apparent advantages into fatal weaknesses. He had studied the ground carefully, noting every hill and valley, every stream and woodlot. More importantly, he had studied his enemies, understanding their strengths, their weaknesses, and most crucially, their psychology. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive battles. 3 emperors, representing the old world and the new, would meet in combat on the fields of Austerlitz. The outcome would determine not just the fate of armies, but the future of Europe itself. The French Revolution had already transformed one nation. Now its greatest son stood poised to reshape an entire continent. As December first dawned cold and grey over the Moravian countryside, Napoleon made his final preparations. His marshals received their orders, his soldiers checked their weapons, and across the lines, the Allied armies made ready for what they believed would be their moment of triumph. None could have imagined that by the next sunset, the entire balance of European power would have shifted forever. The morning of December 2nd, 1805 broke with an eerie stillness across the snow-dusted fields of Austerlitz. Mist clung to the valleys like ghostly fingers, obscuring the movements of armies as soldiers stirred from their restless sleep. In the Allied camps, confidence ran high. Officers shared breakfast around crackling fires, their breath visible in the cold air as they discussed the coming victory. The plan seemed foolproof. Strike at Napoleon's weakened right flank, roll up his line, and drive the French into the frozen ponds that dotted the landscape. Yet in the French camps, a different mood prevailed. Veterans who had marched from the Rhine to the Danube sensed something in the air, an electricity that preceded their emperor's greatest triumphs. They had seen this before, the calculated calm that Napoleon displayed when he held all the cards in a deadly game. These were not men easily fooled by appearances. They knew their commander's genius lay not in obvious strength, but in turning weakness into devastating advantage. Napoleon had spent the previous days playing his role to perfection. French pickets abandoned strong positions with suspicious haste. Supply wagons were seen retreating toward Vienna. Negotiators arrived at Allied headquarters with proposals that reeked of desperation. Every signal suggested an army on the brink of collapse, ready to accept almost any terms to avoid annihilation. The performance was masterful, and the Allied commanders swallowed the bait completely. The centerpiece of Napoleon's deception was his abandonment of the Pratzen Heights, the dominating plateau that commanded the entire battlefield. For any competent general, giving up such ground seemed like madness. The heights offered observation over the surrounding countryside, excellent positions for artillery, and natural defensive advantages that could multiply the effectiveness of any force holding them. Yet Napoleon's withdrawal appeared so genuine, so clearly the act of a desperate commander, that the Allies rushed to occupy the position without questioning the gift they had been given. What the enemy commanders failed to understand was that Napoleon had studied every fold in the ground, every stream and hillock, with the eye of an artist painting his masterpiece. He knew that the Pratzen Heights, while impressive, were also a trap for any army foolish enough to commit too heavily to their defense. The plateau was isolated, difficult to reinforce, and vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. By allowing his enemies to occupy it, Napoleon had transformed their apparent strength into a glaring weakness. As dawn approached, the French emperor made his final adjustments to a plan so audacious that even his own marshals struggled to believe it could succeed. Marshal Soult, commanding the center, received orders that seemed to border on the suicidal. He was to assault the heights directly, driving straight up the slopes against entrenched positions. Marshal Davout, racing from Vienna with his corps, was told to hold the right flank against what would surely be overwhelming numbers. Marshal Lannes would pin the Allied left, preventing reinforcements from reaching the decisive point. The genius lay not in the individual movements, but in their coordination. Napoleon had created a symphony of destruction, with each corps playing its part at precisely the right moment. The Allied attack on his right would stretch their line thin. The assault on the heights would shatter their center just as they committed their reserves. The timing had to be perfect, the execution flawless. A single mistake would spell disaster for the Grande Armée. At 6 a.m., the Allied advance began. Through the morning mist, columns of Russian and Austrian infantry descended from the heights, their white uniforms ghostly in the pale light. They moved with confidence, certain that they were about to crush Napoleon's weakened flank and end the campaign in a single stroke. Behind them, artillery pieces were dragged into position, ready to pour fire into the retreating French. But as the Allies advanced, they were walking into a carefully prepared killing ground. Hidden in woods and behind ridgelines, French divisions waited with the patience of hunters. Napoleon had positioned his forces with mathematical precision, calculating angles of fire, fields of observation, and routes of advance with the cold logic that had made him master of Europe. Every unit knew its role. Every officer understood the stakes. The first clash came at the village of Telnitz, where Austrian columns smashed into Davout's advance guard. The sound of musketry echoed across the frozen fields as white-coated infantry traded volleys with French skirmishers. Smoke began to rise from the village streets as buildings caught fire, creating pillars of black that marked the battle's opening moves. The Austrians pressed forward with determination, convinced that breakthrough was within their grasp. For Napoleon, watching from his command post, these early attacks were music to his ears. Each enemy unit committed to the assault on his right was one less defender on the heights. The Allied commanders were doing exactly what he had predicted, weakening their center to exploit what appeared to be French weakness on the flanks. The trap was closing with mechanical precision. As the morning progressed, the intensity of fighting escalated dramatically. More Austrian and Russian units poured down from the heights, their officers urging them forward with promises of victory and glory. The sound of battle grew from isolated musket shots to a continuous roar that could be heard for miles. Cavalry charges thundered across the frozen ground, sabers flashing in the weak sunlight as horsemen crashed into enemy squares. Yet through it all, Napoleon waited. His staff officers fidgeted nervously, watching Allied reinforcements stream toward the right flank. Surely the moment to strike was now, before the enemy could overwhelm Davout's outnumbered corps. But the Emperor remained calm, his eyes fixed on the heights above, calculating the precise moment when the Allied center would be at its weakest. The crisis came just after 9 a.m. Austrian pressure on the right had reached breaking point, with Davout's men fighting desperately to hold their ground. Allied artillery was finding its range, sending round shot crashing through French ranks. Officers fell, standards toppled, and for a terrifying moment it seemed that Napoleon's gamble had failed. The entire French line appeared on the verge of collapse. But this was the moment Napoleon had been waiting for. Through the lifting mist, he could see the heights above, stripped of most of their defenders, as Allied commanders fed unit after unit into the fighting below. The plateau that had seemed so formidable at dawn now lay almost empty, defended by only a skeleton force of surprised Russians who had expected to spend the day in reserve. The Emperor turned to Marshal Soult, his face calm but his eyes blazing with the fire that had carried him from Corsica to the throne of France. The words he spoke would echo through military history, the signal for one of the most devastating attacks ever launched on a European battlefield. The signal was given, and the French center erupted into motion like a coiled spring suddenly released. Thousands of soldiers who had been lying hidden in the valleys below suddenly materialized from the mist, their blue uniforms dark against the snow as they began their assault on the heights. This was no desperate charge by broken men, but the calculated advance of Europe's finest army, moving with the precision of a machine designed for destruction. Marshal Soult's divisions climbed the slopes with bayonets fixed, their regimental eagles glinting as they caught the morning light. These were veterans of a dozen campaigns, men who had marched from Egypt to the Atlantic, from the pyramids to the palaces of kings. They moved in perfect formation, their drums beating the pas de charge that had struck terror into the hearts of Europe's armies for over a decade. Behind them, artillery pieces were already being manhandled into position, ready to support the attack with devastating firepower. The few Russian defenders on the heights were caught completely off guard. They had been told this was a safe position, a place to wait while their comrades won glory in the valleys below. Instead, they found themselves facing the full fury of Napoleon's assault, outnumbered and isolated on the very ground they had thought impregnable. Panic spread through their ranks as French skirmishers appeared on their flanks, cutting off any hope of retreat. What followed was a masterpiece of tactical coordination that would be studied in military academies for generations to come. As Soult's men stormed the plateau, Napoleon unleashed the second phase of his plan. Fresh divisions that had been held in reserve suddenly appeared on the Allied flanks, their movements perfectly timed to exploit the chaos spreading through enemy ranks. The battlefield, which moments before had seemed to favor the coalition, was transformed into a killing ground where French superiority in training and leadership could be brought to bear. The Allied commanders, watching from their distant headquarters, struggled to comprehend what was happening. Their carefully laid plans were collapsing with terrifying speed. Units that should have been in reserve were already committed to the failed attack on Napoleon's right. The heights, which they had abandoned so carelessly, were now swarming with French soldiers who commanded the entire battlefield. Most critically, their army was being split in two, with no way to coordinate between the scattered fragments. Tsar Alexander, his face pale with shock, demanded explanations that his generals could not provide. How had Napoleon turned defeat into victory so quickly? Where had these French reserves come from? The young ruler, so confident at dawn, now faced the horrifying reality that his army was being systematically destroyed by an enemy he had underestimated. Around him, staff officers scrambled to send new orders, but the battle had already moved beyond their control. On the heights themselves, the fighting reached a crescendo of violence that defied description. Russian guardsmen, the elite of the Tsar's army, made desperate stands around their regimental colors. French infantry pressed forward with fixed bayonets, their officers leading from the front, as they had been taught in the Revolutionary Wars. Artillery pieces were captured and recaptured, their crews fighting hand-to-hand around the smoking cannon. The ground became slippery with blood as men fell in heaps around the gun positions that would decide the fate of Europe. General Kutuzov, the grizzled Russian veteran who had warned against this battle, found himself trapped in the maelstrom he had tried to prevent. His horse was shot from under him, and he barely escaped capture as French cavalry swept across the plateau. The old soldier, who had faced the Turks on the steppes and survived a dozen campaigns, watched in horror as his army disintegrated around him. This was not the honorable defeat of brave men fighting against odds, but the systematic annihilation of forces caught in a trap of their own making. As the morning wore on, Napoleon's victory became complete. The Allied left wing, cut off from the rest of their army, found themselves surrounded by French forces moving with machine-like precision. Entire regiments laid down their arms rather than face useless slaughter. Others attempted to flee across the frozen ponds that dotted the landscape, only to see the ice crack under their weight, sending hundreds of men to watery graves in the frigid depths below. The pursuit that followed was merciless. French cavalry, their sabers bright with blood, rode down fleeing enemies across miles of Moravian countryside. Artillery pieces were abandoned in the mud as their crews fled for their lives. Supply wagons were overturned and looted, their contents scattered across fields littered with the debris of a broken army. The coalition forces that had seemed so formidable at dawn were now little more than scattered bands of demoralized fugitives. Emperor Francis of Austria, his dreams of revenge shattered, fled the battlefield with tears streaming down his face. The heir to centuries of Habsburg glory had been humiliated by a man he considered an upstart, a commoner who had dared to challenge the natural order of Europe. Behind him, his army ceased to exist as an organized force, its survivors streaming eastward in complete disorder. The human cost of Napoleon's victory was staggering. Allied casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, with entire divisions wiped from existence in a matter of hours. The French, by contrast, had suffered relatively light losses, a testament to the precision of their emperor's planning and the skill with which his subordinates had executed his orders. The disparity in casualties was not just a military statistic, but a measure of tactical genius applied with ruthless efficiency. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the battlefield, Napoleon stood among the carnage he had orchestrated. Around him, French soldiers gathered the wounded and collected the vast quantities of captured equipment. Artillery pieces by the hundred, tens of thousands of muskets, military standards that had flown over European battlefields for generations, all now belonged to France. But the true prize was not material wealth, but the shattering of enemy morale that would echo across the continent for months to come. The Emperor's aides brought him reports that confirmed the magnitude of his triumph. 3 Allied generals were dead, dozens more wounded or captured. Entire corps had been destroyed so completely that they would never be reformed. The Third Coalition, which had seemed so powerful just hours before, was now a broken reed that could no longer threaten French dominance of Europe. Yet even in the moment of his greatest triumph, Napoleon's mind was already turning to the political implications of his victory. Austerlitz had been more than a military engagement. It had been a statement to the crowned heads of Europe that their world was changing whether they accepted it or not. The man who had once been dismissed as a Corsican adventurer had proven himself the equal of any general in history, and his empire now stretched from the Atlantic to the heart of Central Europe. In the Allied camps, what remained of the coalition forces struggled to comprehend the scale of their defeat. Officers who had survived the battle sat around dying campfires, their faces blank with shock as they tried to process what they had witnessed. These were men who had grown up believing in the superiority of European royalty, in the natural order that placed kings above commoners. That belief system had been shattered along with their armies on the blood-soaked fields of Austerlitz. The aftermath of the battle would reshape the political landscape of Europe in ways that none the participants could have imagined. Ancient kingdoms would disappear, new nations would be born, and the Holy Roman Empire itself would cease to exist after nearly 1,000 years of history. All of this flowed from those few hours of fighting when Napoleon had demonstrated that genius, properly applied, could overcome any odds. As night fell over the battlefield, French soldiers built fires from the wreckage of enemy equipment. Their songs echoed across fields strewn with the debris of shattered armies, celebrating a victory that would echo through the ages. They had witnessed their emperor at his absolute peak, and they knew that what they had accomplished would be remembered long after they themselves had returned to dust. The political earthquake that followed Austerlitz rippled across Europe with the force of an avalanche. Within days, the Austrian court was suing for peace, their ambassadors arriving at French headquarters with the desperation of men who knew their empire hung by a thread. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed on December 26th, was not a negotiation but a dictation of terms by a conqueror who held all the cards. Austria hemorrhaged territory like a wounded giant. Venice, Istria, and Dalmatia were stripped away and handed to Napoleon's puppet kingdom of Italy. Tyrol and Vorarlberg, Alpine provinces that had been Habsburg for centuries, were gifted to Bavaria as a reward for their alliance with France. The German territories that had formed the backbone of Austrian influence vanished overnight, redistributed among Napoleon's allies like pieces on a chessboard. The human cost was staggering. 4 million subjects, Entire populations who had lived under Habsburg rule for generations suddenly found themselves citizens of foreign powers. The Austrian treasury, already strained by years of warfare, was ordered to pay an indemnity of 40 million gold francs, a sum so enormous it would cripple the empire's finances for years to come. The proud monarchy that had once dominated Central Europe was reduced to a shadow of its former self. And so, as the sun set on December 2nd, 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte had achieved something that would echo through the corridors of history forever. In a single day, through tactical genius and strategic brilliance, he had shattered the combined might of Europe's ancient monarchies and established himself as the undisputed master of the continent. Austerlitz was not just a victory, it was the birth of a new European order, forged in blood and steel on the frozen fields of Moravia.